Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today. Thank you for joining the roundtable that's sponsored by Sidious Tech. We brought together a fairly rich set of industry experts to talk about our exposure to FHIR implementation across the healthcare industry. And we want to use this as an opportunity to share our learnings and our sort of our practical experience with FHIR implementation across healthcare ecosystem, and also to talk a little bit about what we feel will be the impact on imaging workflows in the near future. Sidious Tech has a fairly unique perspective in this space, as we've been working on FHIR implementations for the last 2 or 3 years. And this has been predominantly on the payer and provider market, but a lot of these learnings will also carry forward into the implementation for imaging technology companies. And again, we'll get into some of the details as we walk through the session today. Over the course of the session, we'll be happy to take questions. There's a questions box in the bottom right of your screen, which is in the GoToWebinar, the GoToMeeting setup. And we'll be addressing those questions over the course of the discussion. So with that, I'll move to the next slide and ask our team to introduce themselves. So Chris, over to you.
Hi, my name's Chris Lindop. I'm a healthcare systems and interoperability leader. I've been involved in the industry, particularly with IHE as early as 1998, doing testing in the basement of the RSNA building. Since then, I've been co-chair, and I've done a lot of leadership with developing the profiles, such as most recently the AI workflow profile, which you can see components of it in the AI interoperability demonstration this year. With no further ado, I'm here to help you see what we're doing with interoperability and FHIR and AI and everything else.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Nishchal Hegde. I'm a consultant neurosurgeon in Bangalore, India, and I'm also an assistant professor at Ramaiah Memorial Hospital here. I've been in the medical field for about 15 years and just over 5 years in neurosurgery. I also have a particular interest in integrating technology into the healthcare field. So I'm happy to be here and take you forward through this discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Nishchal.
Yes. So hi, everyone. This is Swanand. I'm Senior Vice President at Sidious Tech for data management. I've been in industry for almost 20 years now, and I've been working on interoperability related projects at Sidious Tech. Started my career with HL7, V2.10, moved on to CCDAs, and now FHIR. I'm also leading our development that we're doing at Sidious Tech in terms of FHIR and FHIR enablement for our customers. So happy to be here, and hope I'll be able to share certain experience that I have been seeing here with you all of you now.
Thank you, Swanand. And my name is Shujadas Gupta. I work with the medical technology market at Sidious Tech. I have over 15 years of experience working in the healthcare IT space, and I also lead the interoperability and imaging practice. So with that, as we go to the next slide, we'll request Swanand to maybe talk a little bit about his experience on FHIR implementation.
Okay. So first of all, FHIR has been around for quite some time as a concept. I think 2014 timeframe or so came in. Earlier we had HL7 V2.x, which was more like we used to talk in terms of ADTs and overuse, and we still continue to talk in terms of that. Then we came into the age of V3, that was CCDAs and CDAs and all. And then in 2014, the FHIR came in. FHIR is it's been developed again by HL7. But also been contributed by industry folks, practitioners, and technology companies like us. The basic difference that that's between the earlier versions and this one is FHIR not only talks about the format in which data to be exchanged, but it also talks about the kind of APIs and signatures of the APIs and whatnot. And another big change that I see is when you talk in terms of ADTs and overuse of the word, you would be sending the entire message at a time. And if you want to just query for one small unit of the information, then yeah, you still need to get the entire ADT. But here in FHIR, you can probably query for one small unit. You want to query for process, you can do that. You want to query for medications, you can do that. And it's going to be more like a pull rather than a push, and that's exactly what it's all about. It's been seen that the world is moving towards API-based data communication, and I think FHIR has now kicked in at the right time. Yes. This is a slide that talks about the survey that we did with our customers. And first, one small disclaimer here that most of the customers that we talk to, they're all either providers or the payers. And when I say payers, again, some of the blues or so. So I won't go through all the numbers here, but some of the numbers which are really interesting. We all know ONC rule has come in, and CMS also has said that IPA rule has kicked in. 39% of the folks that we talk to, they are targeting the enforcement date. I think almost everybody else is talking about the date that is a little bit later later in next year. And you might see that 89% is prefer on-prem, and again this might come as a surprise, and I'll again talk about why it is. It's more like again, these guys whom we have been talking to, they have made severe investment, I think a long-term investment in their on-prem hardware, and they are taking a little while to make a decision to go to cloud. They're saying that okay, we'll stick to our on-prem, see how it goes, and then probably in future we will make some sort of a cloud investment out there. The last number that I wanted to talk about was almost 51% of the folks that we talked to told us that they are expecting a large amount of investments in terms of building FHIR capabilities. And in fact, I can take one more, that is almost a majority of the people are looking at going beyond the rule. They're saying that they don't want to comply with the rule and stay there. They want to go to use cases which are much beyond the rule than just exchanging data using US CDI or DaVinci specs or so. They want to go for things like changing the way data is exchanged or changing the way some of the workflows are getting implemented right now. But those are all will be coming little later. The first target is for everybody is to comply with the rule. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. These are the certification timelines. 1st of May, the rule has come in, and the first thing that people will have to comply to is attestation for condition of certification. That is sometime in the January timeframe that they have to do. And first thing, and this is ONC rule that I'm talking about, not a CMS rule. The CMS rule is mainly for payers, and their timelines are slightly different. In the May 2022, people will have to comply with the exceptions required and everything else, and the FHIR APIs, and they will have to expose data to external world using FHIR APIs. And May 2023 is a time when they have to comply the last leg of the compliance, and that is come of the EHR export capability. So you can go to a health system and say, okay, can you give me data export for Swanand's history, and then you should be able to give that. So that is the last day, but yeah, fairly stretched out due to this year being COVID. Otherwise, this earlier when the rule was proposed, the timelines were a little bit more cramped. But now they are fairly stretched out, and I think everybody will be able to meet them easily without much trouble. US CDI it is a format that ONC and CMS both have prescribed for data exchange and this is mainly for clinical data exchange. For each of the entities that we have in our clinical segment, so things like nodes, things like vital signs, things like patients' diagnosis and demographics and whatnot. There are different resources, as they call, that are there. What USCDI does is it's basically a profile which is on top of the base FHIR, and it gives you an implementable way to do it. So FHIR, if you look at just as a generic FHIR, it comprises of lots of resources. USCDI only takes a dig at clinical entities, and it talks about almost can you stay on the slide? Oh, it talks about almost 35 odd entities which are required for clinical data being exchanged across. And the timelines again are 24 months from within the rule getting finalized, and it also talks about the API specification. It also talks about the smaller things like if you want to query, let's say, patient, what are the parameters using which you can query. So you want to search, provide a procedure. These are the 4 parameters that you need to expose. If you want to search for patient demographics, these are the 3 parameters that you want. So this goes to that nitty-gritty level just to ensure that if everybody, everybody goes and implements this profile, it won't be that I search at one health system using one parameter and that parameter doesn't work on another one. It will work because it actually talks about all of that. I can see, Shuja, you are smiling, but this was the problem we saw.
Yes. So in fact, one question that I had for you, Swanand, was when you've gone through these implementations, what has been the biggest challenge you've seen? Because US CDI and ONC have certain standards, right, which you're sort of baselining against. But in terms of your practical experience, are there any areas where you're seeing health systems have challenges or at the actual implementation level?
So at the actual implementation level, should I take example from I think 3 or 4 folks that we are currently working with. In fact, we are implementing this whole thing for them. The biggest challenge that we have seen is in the mapping itself. So they wouldn't have all the attributes that are required by US CDI profile. There are times, and it's not too many, but there are times that I have seen that mandatory attributes were set by US CDI, and it just doesn't exist in the database. So we have to circumvent it, or we have to find what to do about it. But this is the one biggest thing that we have seen. Other things, not really much. So the format otherwise is fairly straightforward and pretty much flattened. But this is the biggest thing that we have seen. Another thing that I see is it's not really from US CDI perspective, but there are types of customers where we have seen that they have one database for their claims data management, one database for their clinical data management. And US CDI, when you expose the data, expose this whole thing to external world, the data has to come in from both of them. Correct? You're talking about procedures, it has to come from both the places. So sometimes they don't have a single source of truth, and the query has to go to 2 different databases. So they are working on how to do about it. So that's the second one that I have seen.
And the other quick question that I had was, how do you manage patient consent? So in terms of accessing the data, is that something that systems already exist for? Is that something they've had to implement from scratch?
So consent management, the way Rule has talked about, I think most of them will have to go for it. Most of our customers, they have patient portal, member portal, but they don't really have per se a consent management component into it. They don't have screens to capture consent the way it is required by the rule. Most of the time, what we have seen earlier, the consent is to give consent to my existing provider, my PCP kind of a thing. Or the second thing that we have seen is my data can be used for research purpose, correct? So give consent for that. Or maybe in terms of trials as well. But giving consent for my data to be accessed by an app, or for my data to be accessed by maybe someone else, I delegate it to someone else, correct? That is something which was not there. So everybody is actually grappling with it, if I have to say that. Grappling as in they are now finding that this is a new thing that they have to do. So yes, everybody is doing, it's a new kid on the block.
Makes sense. And I think this will be applicable to imaging systems as well as we think about their workflows. So thanks for the background, Swanand. Yeah. And, Chris, if you wanted to maybe talk a little bit about the work that was happening on the interop side, in terms of how FHIR is being aligned with existing standards that we use in imaging workflows today.
Sure. I mean, here we're talking mainly about FHIR, but FHIR and of course DICOM is a common standard that we use for imaging interoperability. But there are many other standards that are involved in the healthcare realm, and it's quite staggering. How do we pull all these standards and use these standards has always been a challenge. And that's one of the things that what I discussed earlier, what we do in IHE, we profile standards for healthcare solutions. The users define the need, and the users and vendors together to identify what are the most applicable standards that can be implemented in a realizable time frame. And in the usual workcase cycle, it's about 18 months that we come from a concept to a fully integrated solution. What I'd like to share with you today is some of the work that's been going on to get us to that point. So I'm ready for that. You know, there are three primary segments that I want to talk to you about today. First is that IHE Radiology 2020. What have we done in IHE Radiology? We've done two things. AI result, and that's primarily a DICOM SR result profile for what AI results be looking like from the the AS systems. And then there's the AI workflow for imaging. That's the profile that I championed, I authored to get out to show how these AI models will work together within the ecosystem, how they're orchestrated, how they're recorded. That's all part of that profile. And of course, we're going on continuing to an AI in radiology white paper and looking at contrast administration management. AI in radiology white paper is more focused on a roadmap of how we're going to come up with solutions. AI is a big realm, and there's a lot of different moving parts. And what our goal is to identify the moving parts and try to lock them down. Then there's the what we're doing in Working Group 20, the HL7 Imaging Integration Working Group. This is essentially a joint working group with DICOM and HL7. Our primary goal at this moment is really focused on how we get how do we get a seamless interoperability between FHIR and DICOM Web. Some of the things that we've done recently is the imaging study resource. That's the primary resource that's out there that ties DICOM to HL7 for the when communicating with electronic medical record. Other things we're looking at is is dose summaries. We talked about what we did with AI results and SR. Moving on to the next level, let's get that SR to FHIR mapping, so we have so that we have a real clean interoperability solution to reporting systems, and as well as looking at the entire workflow of looking at converting what we've done in modality workflows, HL9, getting all that mapped to FHIR. So these are some of the key things that we've been working on, and certainly I invite you all to work with us as we're going through the process for the future. I'd also want to point out what's done in Project Gemini. This is a project that has been started, a joint project between IHE and HL7 to really synergize the work and make sure that there's not too much overlap of what's being done with the implementation guide in HL7 versus an IHE profile, which is on FHIR. If you look at if you look at what profiles that are listed in IHE or the FHIR implementation guide registry, you'll find IHE profiles there as well. And that gives you an idea of how we're synchronizing both worlds. And certainly, as I say, as the tagline says, interoperability is not a generation. And as we grow and we develop, we'll be getting better solutions out there for the user community to get our products to interoperate.
Fantastic. Thanks for that overview, Chris. The other, a couple of other things that we just wanted to touch upon today was, if you go to the next slide, as we've gone through our FHIR implementation with a variety of customers, if you can go to the next slide, please. So as we've gone through the FHIR, the previous slide, if you don't mind. Yeah. Beyond just sort of the traditional adopters of FHIR, right, which would be healthcare technology companies, payer systems, etc. We're also seeing a broader trend of FHIR adoption by the technology industry as a whole, right? And it's one of the sort of strong indicators that you get in terms of how mainstream FHIR has started to become, right? So the first part, of course, is we've got you've got a relatively mature standard in place now. You've got a regulatory guidance for FHIR adoption by several critical actors within healthcare workflows, right? Particularly around what are traditionally data silos. But in addition to that, we're also seeing companies like Apple build out the HealthKit on top of FHIR. We're looking at Google with FHIR API being provided. The recent Microsoft Cloud for Healthcare, Azure already had a sort of FHIR APIs provided as part of a cloud native offering. The Cloud for Healthcare offering that they just launched again has FHIR at the heart of that. And we've also seen a movement of EMR companies, even just beyond the traditional, or rather the regulatory requirements around FHIR for US CDI and data exposure, to use FHIR as a medium for data integration. So there is an overall technology trend heading in this direction, and again, that's supplemented by the interoperability work that Chris talked about, as well as the benefit of having US CDI provide a relatively constrained implementation of FHIR, which sort of helps with the implementation of FHIR by, again, healthcare technology systems. And as we think about it in the context of imaging, right, when you look at all these sort of different trends, themes tied together, there are certain challenges we've traditionally had in the imaging world, right? One is the ability to connect with information systems that sit outside the radiology department, the ability to provide a composite set of both imaging and non-imaging information at the point of care, and the ability to, the newer challenge we're facing is the ability to integrate newer technology actors into imaging ecosystem. Right? So when you talk about mobile devices, when you talk about AI ML models coming into imaging ecosystem, FHIR has an important role to enable the accelerated adoption of all these different themes. And what we worked on with Dr. Nishchit was picking up one of these use cases around clinical decision support and extrapolating on the themes that Swanand and Chris talked about, where we looked at adopting a US CDI-centric integration within EMR and extrapolating that use case to see what would happen if you were able to make the information that is currently provided by US CDI available in the course of a radiology review. And so with that, I'll request maybe Nishchit to walk us through this use case.
Thanks, Shuja. So like Shuja was speaking about the workflow and the importance of this, I thought I'd elucidate it with this interesting quick example. So this was actually a patient who came to us recently. It was a 40-year-old woman who came into the emergency with acute right lower limb weakness. And this is all the information that was there on the radiology request, just that single line, and possibly a cerebrovascular accident. And as you can imagine, the patient was taken for a scan. And the next slide would show you that, yeah, these were her images. The flare image on the top left is all that shows any significance in terms of the hyperintensities in the bilateral substantia nigra and the periaqueductal regions. The diffusion weighted sequence on the right, there's no restriction. And on the bottom, there's the SWI sequence, which shows no blooming or hemorrhages. And finally, the contrast sequence showed absolutely no enhancement. So initially, we thought it was a stroke patient and a case of stroke, but definitely there was no restriction on DWI. And going to the next slide, you can see that the radiologists at this point were quite perplexed. They had very little to go on, so they thought the differentials would include maybe a demyelinating disorder based on the hyperintensity, again, but it's not in the white matter. Maybe neuromyelitis optica or MS, and the periaqueductal region, so of highlighting, so that maybe Wernicke's encephalopathy with that hyperintensity there. So to give them more support in their differential, they asked for a screening MRI of the whole spine to rule out anything else. They looked at the anti-NMO antibody serology, and obviously to correlate with the clinical findings. And going to the next slide, we can see that with this limited information, a clinician adding the clinical data could do so much more. We found that this was a resident Indian lady who developed this progressive weakness since 8 hours and then only presented to the emergency. And interestingly enough, she had recent travel history to Brazil, and she developed a fever on returning. She had fever, cough, and headache, and this all preceded the weakness onset by about 5 days. So while they did think of NMO, her optic nerves were absolutely normal. The only finding was that she had right lower limb weakness. So we had to think of different investigative lineups here, including a stroke in young workup because she'd come in with weakness, a demyelination workup based on the scan image, and ultimately with the history, that really suggested that we also look in at infections as an important etiology here. And let's add some lab data to this mix. So the stroke in young investigations turned out to be all normal. There was absolutely no autoimmune or vasculitis serology, retroviral negative, and despite the lipid profile being a little deranged. And the radiologist's first suspicion of NMO, well, those antibodies were also negative. So it was actually the CSF analysis which proved that this was indeed a resolving viral infection. And the CSF also showed a non-specific weak oligoclonal band positivity. So it could have been something post-infective. As you can see on the next slide, adding all this information together with the radiologists, very sparse information, but they looked at an image, thought it was maybe something demyelination, maybe an example of demyelination, and then adding her history of travel and fever, and then finally with the lab findings showing this resolving viral infection and oligoclonal band positivity together, we definitely thought it was maybe post-infectious demyelination. It was very odd, so we had to go to literature after this and find that isolated substantia nigra involvement was only reported in St. Louis encephalitis. And this is not an endemic disease to India. We did all the viral PCR for her CSF that on diseases that were endemic to India, but this was endemic to America. So the history and the labs were really helpful in clinching the diagnosis. And on starting a trial of steroids, this patient remarkably improved in a matter of days and completely improved within a few weeks. As you can see on the next slide, this shows her before and after treatment onset pictures. At presentation, those hyperintensities are all there in the midbrain. And a week following treatment onset, they're already beginning to diminish on the FLAIR sequence. So this patient really did well. And I keep reiterating, it's so important that this sequence, this workflow happens efficiently, because if this was actually a case of stroke and she'd presented late to the emergency, delaying diagnosis by running a series of meandering investigations, it really wouldn't have helped her cause, and probably, she'd have landed up in permanent deficit by the time treatment was initiated. Right, Shuja? I think that proves, makes a real point for this integration.
No, definitely. I think that's a great example of the value add that could come in as we look at a more streamlined integration. One of the questions that has come in, right, which I wanted to take up was someone's asked, what will be the impact on teleradiology workflows through these type of integrations? Do you think there would be a meaningful change if you were able to provide this type of data?
Oh, definitely, because most of the imaging work now happens in diagnostic centers. A lot of the work also happens in non-tertiary care hospitals, non-multiple specialty hospitals. So, and in Corona times, everything's become tele or remote consults and diagnosis. So imagine a radiologist sitting on the other side of the world, having only this little bit of information and images to go by. And, it's an odd hour. You really can't talk to a physician. There's maybe not a clinician who's got the patient into the center. So there's very little to go by, especially in cases where the patients aren't forthcoming with history unless asked by someone. And it has to be in the system at the disposal of the radiologist to really, mitigate any roadblocks and get that diagnosis faster and initiate early treatment. It's hugely important today.
Great. And I think probably one more question that's come in is on the technology side of things, is how is multi-tenancy a challenge, right, in terms of when you look at prior adoption? So Swanand, when you've done your prior implementations, how have you addressed issues related to multi-tenancy? Is that something that's defined or?
Okay, so multi-tenancy in the form of data storage is something that we definitely prescribe to our customers. So we give them a FHIR repository to store all their FHIR data. And as part of FHIR repository, we give them a design which is a multi-tenant one. So essentially, every table that you have the data will have a tenant kind of a column. But that just easily said than done, because when you receive the hit from on the API itself, the API also needs to be multi-tenant. So it needs to know from which from which client it's coming, and depending on that, then it will make a right query at the back. On that translation has to happen, which is again going to be part of the API. So it is something which is required, and we have been doing this with our customer. But there is no one answer to this. There is something to do with DB, something to do with API.
Understood. Great. So thanks for that, Swanand. And with that, we are right at the half-hour mark. So again, I want to thank everybody for their time. In case there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll share a brief recording of the session along with the handout. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.